Emma had always been content with the quiet. She was the kind of person who found beauty in ordinary things. The soft rustling of leaves outside her apartment, the warm, familiar smell of her little bookstore, the comforting predictability of her daily routines. Each day, she would carefully arrange books by genre, alphabetize authors, and tidy shelves that seemed to absorb every story they held. In a world rushing toward the next moment, Emma cherished lingering in the present, capturing the life around her like a collector of memories. One winter evening, as she flipped the open sign to closed and reached for her coat, the door creaked open. A man stepped in, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and offered a sheepish smile. "Sorry, I know you're closing," he said, his voice gentle, as if he were afraid of breaking the quiet that clung to the bookstore like a protective charm. Emma smiled back and assured him he could stay, feeling a spark of curiosity. His name was Daniel, and he seemed the opposite of her. Spontaneous, charming, someone who lived his life with unbridled energy. Yet they spent hours that night talking about everything and nothing, their voices the only sound in the otherwise silent shop. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's life began to shift. She found herself waiting eagerly for his visits, and soon, their encounters weren't by chance. They were planned, woven into her routine with the ease of habit and the warmth of a welcome sunrise. Daniel had a way of seeing life that both captivated and challenged her. He'd drag her to crowded cafes where they'd make up stories about the people around them, laugh till their sides hurt, and walk for miles under starlit skies, making memories from mundane moments. Emma found herself saying things like, "If I could freeze time, it would be in this moment with you." And though they never spoke the words, both knew that their lives had become entwined, like vines growing together, each supporting the other, rooted in a love that blossomed in quiet, simple days. But as winter melted into spring, subtle changes began to cloud their happiness. One morning, as they walked together, Daniel paused mid-sentence, his face etched with confusion. "What was I saying?" he asked, brushing it off with a laugh. But the worry in his eyes lingered. Over time, these small moments multiplied. Forgotten appointments, misplaced items, missed dates. At first they laughed about it, blaming the distractions of life. But deep down, Emma felt an unspoken fear in him, a tremor beneath the surface. After weeks of trying to ignore the growing signs, they went to see a doctor. The sterile white walls and clinical scent filled Emma with dread as though the very air pressed down upon her. Daniel held her hand, his grip firm yet trembling as they awaited the results. The diagnosis shattered them: early-onset Alzheimer's. The doctor's words echoed in Emma's mind long after they left. She felt as if she'd been plunged into cold water, struggling to breathe, every future memory she had envisioned with Daniel now teetering on the edge of loss. Emma's world became an endless pattern of remembering for both of them. Each day, she would gently remind him of who he was, who they were together, recounting the stories they had lived, the promises they had made. She would tell him how they met, how they'd shared their dreams over cups of coffee and hidden corners of the city. She'd described their first date in such vivid detail that he would smile as though he could see it unfolding before him, even as it slipped away the moment he blinked. As the days passed, Daniel's episodes grew longer. There were mornings when he would gaze at her with a hollow look, his expression one of faint recognition but no understanding. "Emma," he would whisper, as though the word itself was fragile, and she'd feel her heart break a little more each time. She knew he was trying to hold on to her, to keep her close even as he drifted further into an unfamiliar place she could never reach. They clung to the good days, the ones where he was more himself, where his laughter still sounded like music, and he would look at her the way he had in those early days, with all the warmth and love she had grown to need. But then the day came when Daniel woke up and didn't recognize her at all. Emma found him sitting by the window, looking out with an expression of distant longing. She approached him gently, and he turned to her, his face empty, his gaze distant. "I don't know who you are," he whispered, his voice trembling. Emma felt the words tear through her, sharper than any blade, and she fought to keep her composure. She wanted to remind him, to bring him back, but she knew it was beyond her power. For weeks she watched him fade, his laughter growing softer, his smile becoming rarer, like a sunset slipping over the horizon. Emma's world shrank to the walls of their apartment, her days filled with caring for a man who was both everything she had ever wanted and a stranger in her life. She would read to him from his favorite books, hoping to stir some memory, to bring back even a flicker of recognition. On some days, he'd listen with a faraway look in his eyes. On others, he would simply sit in silence, as though the words meant nothing. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, Daniel looked at her with a sudden, rare clarity. His eyes softened, and he reached for her hand. "Emma," he whispered, as though he were anchoring himself in that moment. "Thank you for everything." They sat in silence, holding hands, their love unspoken but understood. She knew he was saying goodbye in his own way, and though she wanted to cry, to beg him to stay, she simply held him, savoring that fragile, precious moment. As winter returned, Daniel took his final breath. The silence in the room was overwhelming, pressing down on her with a suffocating weight. Emma sat beside him long after he was gone, holding his hand as though her touch alone could keep him from slipping away completely. The world felt unbearably empty, a hollow echo of the life they had shared. In the weeks that followed, Emma wandered through her days in a daze, returning to the bookstore but feeling like a ghost of herself. Every shelf, every corner of her life held memories of him, like fragments of a dream she could no longer hold on to. She found herself visiting the places they had loved, revisiting the stories she had told him, clinging to the pieces of a life they had lived together. And though the pain lingered, Emma eventually found comfort in knowing that Daniel's memory hadn't disappeared completely. It lived on in her, in the whispers of the past that would forever be woven into the fabric of her being. Love, she realized, wasn't something bound by memory alone. It was in her every heartbeat, in every tear, in every quiet moment she spent remembering him. As she stood by the window one evening, watching the city lights flicker on, she felt a calm settle over her. Daniel might be gone, but he was still with her, like a quiet whisper she could carry with her always. This story embraces the fullness of Emma's journey with Daniel, making listeners feel her love, loss, and the strength she finds in cherishing his memory, even as he fades.